December 26, 211 AD. The imperial palace in Rome echoed not with triumph but with tragedy. In the luxurious marble chambers designed to reflect the grandeur of empire, a mother's wails shattered the silence as she cradled the lifeless body of her son, his blood soaking through her royal robes. Julia Domna, once revered as the intellectual queen of a vast empire, now faced the unbearable reality that her son Geta had been murdered not by a foreign invader, nor by conspirators in the shadows, but by his own brother, Caracalla, the very man she had raised to share power and uphold the Severan vision of unity. This was not just another violent episode in the turbulent chronicles of Rome. It was the moment when family collapsed under the weight of ambition, when the Roman ideal of shared imperial rule crumbled in a single act of intimate betrayal. This is the story of how two brothers, raised to rule together, instead became the architects of Rome's moral disintegration, and how a dynasty's dream of dual authority ignited a purge that would redefine the very concept of Roman power. It begins decades earlier, in a time when Rome, battered by civil war, sought stability in a new kind of emperor. Septimius Severus, born not in Rome but in the North African city of Leptis Magna, was an outsider who seized power through military strength during the chaos of 193 AD, a year when 5 men claimed the throne. Lacking the traditional legitimacy of Rome's aristocratic rulers, Severus carved his authority from battlefield victories, administrative reform, and a public image forged in war. His reign marked the rise of a dynasty that sought not to imitate the past but to redefine the future. He married Julia Domna, a noblewoman from Syria renowned for her intellect, political acumen, and unshakable influence. Together, they envisioned a new Rome, multicultural, disciplined, and ruled not by a single autocrat but by a harmonious family. Their sons, Lucius Septimius Bassianus, later known as Caracalla, and Publius Septimius Geta, were born in close succession and raised as co-heirs. Their upbringing was no ordinary royal education. They were groomed not just as successors but as partners in rule. Educated in Greek philosophy, Roman law, Eastern diplomacy, and military science, they were taught to understand the empire as a complex network of cultures, languages, and administrative systems. They trained side by side, appeared in public together, and were repeatedly reminded that their destiny was not to dominate one another but to govern as equals. When Severus elevated them to imperial rank, he was attempting a bold political experiment, true diarchy, where 2 emperors would hold equal power over the vast Roman world. No precedent existed for such complete parity between co-rulers. Rome had witnessed brief joint rule before, but always with a senior and junior emperor. Severus's plan was different. He envisioned his sons as twin pillars of imperial authority. But what seemed like a pragmatic strategy for stability quickly revealed its fault lines. From the beginning, their personalities clashed. Caracalla was aggressive, commanding, and favored by the army for his boldness. Geta was more reflective, intellectual, and preferred by the senatorial and bureaucratic elites. These differences, at first complementary, became competitive. Decisions that once involved compromise devolved into arguments. Military strategy clashed with legal caution. Administrative appointments became battlegrounds for influence. The imperial court began to split into rival camps. Severus, still alive, attempted to mediate, but the strain was evident. He ordered court architects to redesign the palace, creating separate quarters and entrances for his sons. Even in daily life, the emperors needed physical separation to prevent conflict. After Severus's death in early 211 AD during a campaign in Britain, the fragile balance shattered. The brothers returned to Rome in separate processions, their entourages swelling with ambitious men eager to align with the more dominant ruler. Despite their father's dying plea, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others," the rivalry intensified. Within months, it was clear that joint rule was failing. The empire's administrative machinery, designed for one sovereign, struggled under the weight of dual authority. Governors received conflicting orders. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, fractured into hostile factions. Public rituals required elaborate choreography to ensure both emperors were equally honored without giving one precedence. The people of Rome, long accustomed to the stability of the Severan reign, began to whisper about the brewing storm. Senators, artists, generals, and even priests were forced to take sides. Neutrality became dangerous. Julia Domna found herself walking a tightrope of divided loyalties. As the only figure still trusted by both sons, she assumed the impossible task of reconciliation. She arranged dinners, religious ceremonies, and family meetings, hoping to bridge the growing divide. But each attempt only exposed the depth of their hatred. Caracalla, increasingly paranoid, began seeing Geta not just as a rival but as a threat to his survival. Geta, more trusting, failed to grasp the danger until it was too late. The palace, once the beating heart of Roman power, became a silent war zone. Guards patrolled the hallways between the brothers' quarters. Messengers carried imperial edicts with fear and trembling. Courtiers who smiled at Geta in the morning were executed by nightfall for offending Caracalla. The empire's famed efficiency was replaced by suspicion, confusion, and fear. Julia Domna, heartbroken, persisted in her efforts. She believed that family could prevail over ambition, that love could survive power. But her greatest strength, her closeness to both sons, became her fatal vulnerability. Caracalla knew that Geta would only meet with him if their mother mediated. And so he devised the ultimate deception. He proposed one more meeting in Julia's private chambers, a supposed reconciliation on sacred family ground. Geta agreed, unguarded, trusting the woman who had given him life and the brother who once played beside him as a child. What followed was not merely a murder, but a ritualistic annihilation. In the sanctity of their mother's room, surrounded by symbols of peace and unity, Caracalla's guards stormed in and struck down Geta before he could flee. He died in Julia's arms, his blood staining her robes and the marble floor beneath. Her screams echoed through the palace like a curse. Caracalla had not only killed his brother, he had destroyed his mother's soul, defiled the very idea of brotherhood, and ended any pretense of shared rule. But Caracalla was not finished. He understood that a single murder, however calculated, was not enough. Geta had allies, supporters, friends. In the weeks that followed, Caracalla unleashed one of the most brutal purges in Roman history. More than 20,000 people, senators, generals, administrators, servants, were executed, exiled, or silenced. Statues of Geta were destroyed. His name was erased from inscriptions. Paintings were defaced. Official records were altered to reflect only one emperor. It was a systematic erasure of not just a man but of the very idea that he had ever existed. Caracalla claimed it was justice, that Geta had plotted treason, conspired with foreign enemies, and planned his own coup. But few believed the lies. Rome had seen tyrants before. It had endured madness and cruelty. But never before had the empire's soul been so nakedly violated. A murder in a mother's arms. A brother's betrayal turned into official policy. A purge that extinguished not just lives but trust. Ancient historian Cassius Dio, who witnessed these events, later wrote that he had never seen such hatred between kin. He understood what had been lost. Not merely a brother, not even a dynasty, but a vision of empire rooted in harmony. Caracalla's rule continued for years, marked by military campaigns, monumental building projects, and growing instability. But he was never able to wash away the blood. His paranoia deepened. His policies grew harsher. He surrounded himself with flatterers and guards, never fully escaping the shadow of the brother he had slain. Julia Domna, broken by grief, remained by his side, not out of loyalty, but because she had nowhere else to go. Her intellect, once celebrated, was now caged by sorrow. She died a few years later, her legacy twisted by the crimes of her children. The empire, already strained, continued its slow descent into crisis. The Severan dream of shared rule became a cautionary tale for future generations. Caracalla had won absolute power, but at a cost that no victory parade or triumphal arch could conceal. In the heart of Rome, the people remembered not the speeches or reforms but the day the empire turned on itself. The day brother killed brother. The day trust died. The day Rome lost its soul. In the weeks following Geta's assassination, Rome underwent a transformation more psychological than physical. The city remained intact, the legions stayed loyal, and the bureaucracy still functioned, but something invisible and essential had fractured. It wasn't just the erasure of Geta's image from public monuments or the silencing of his name in senatorial decrees that changed the atmosphere. It was the collective understanding that even the most sacred familial bonds could be casually destroyed in pursuit of total control. The ordinary Roman citizen, already accustomed to the capriciousness of imperial succession, now internalized a deeper fear that no law, no tradition, no virtue was powerful enough to restrain an emperor's will once he had tasted absolute power unchecked by rival or restraint. Caracalla, having orchestrated one of the most cold-blooded crimes in Roman history, immediately began a campaign to rebrand his image as the sole rightful emperor and guardian of Roman destiny. He issued edicts proclaiming his love for the army, promising further bonuses and expanding privileges to secure their unwavering loyalty. These gestures, though popular among soldiers, placed a tremendous strain on the imperial treasury, already weakened by the costs of maintaining dual courts and recent campaigns in Britain. The Senate, humiliated and emasculated by its inability to protect Geta or even protest his murder, became little more than a rubber stamp for Caracalla's legislation. Senators who had once dared to express independent thought now offered only obsequious praise, while those suspected of mourning Geta in private were swiftly eliminated through fabricated charges or forced suicide. Intellectuals, philosophers, and orators who had once found refuge in the embrace of Julia Domna's salon discovered that silence was now the only path to survival. The once vibrant cultural life of the capital faded under the shadow of terror. Rome's administrative apparatus continued to function, but its spirit had been hollowed out. Prefects and governors carried out orders without question, not because they agreed with Caracalla's policies, but because they feared joining the thousands already purged. Loyalty was no longer to the empire or to law, but to the man who ruled it through blood and fear. In public, Caracalla portrayed himself as a reincarnation of Alexander the Great, the legendary Macedonian conqueror whom he idolized since youth. He adopted Hellenistic dress on occasion, commissioned artwork comparing himself to ancient heroes, and restructured parts of his court to reflect Greek monarchical customs. He even renamed cities and military units in homage to his imagined predecessor. In private, however, Caracalla grew increasingly unstable, consumed by paranoia and haunted by the ghost of his brother. He ordered bodyguards to remain with him at all times, including while he slept. Servants reported that he woke frequently during the night, sometimes shouting in fear or murmuring to himself. Physicians and astrologers, once courtiers of intellect, now served primarily to soothe the emperor's crumbling psyche. He turned increasingly to religion, not out of faith, but desperation, offering sacrifices to gods old and new, from Jupiter to Serapis, seeking absolution for a crime that could not be undone. His mother, Julia Domna, remained in the palace, but her role had changed irreversibly. Once the nexus of political and cultural life, she was now a figure of quiet sorrow, her voice diminished, her influence limited to moments of calm negotiation between increasingly volatile factions. Her relationship with Caracalla was strained, an emotional prison forged by blood and betrayal. She had watched one son die and the other transform into something monstrous, and yet, she remained by his side, bound not only by maternal instinct but by the reality that her own survival depended on maintaining proximity to power. Caracalla embarked on military campaigns, partly to distract himself and partly to rekindle the legitimacy he believed conquest would restore. He led expeditions into Germania and the eastern provinces, often manufacturing conflicts to justify movement and martial display. His command style was hands-on and brutal, admired by soldiers for his willingness to share their hardships but feared for his merciless discipline. These campaigns yielded mixed results militarily but succeeded politically, giving the emperor a mobile stage from which to present himself as a warrior king. The empire's infrastructure groaned under the weight of his demands. Roads were torn up by marching legions, cities requisitioned for supplies, and provinces drained of taxes and resources to fund the endless promises made to troops. Rome, once known for its balance between civil and military power, now resembled a garrison state, its emperor more general than governor. Perhaps his most infamous act outside the murder of Geta was the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, formerly known as the Constitutio Antoniniana. This sweeping decree extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free men within the empire, a move with profound consequences. On the surface, it appeared magnanimous, a grand gesture of inclusion. But the true motivation was fiscal. Roman citizens were subject to particular taxes, and by expanding the citizen base, Caracalla hoped to refill the imperial coffers drained by military spending and court extravagance. While it did momentarily increase state revenue, it diluted the prestige of Roman citizenship, once a cherished and hard-won status, now reduced to an instrument of imperial finance. It also deepened social fractures, as provincial elites resented being treated as mere revenue sources while the army remained the favored child of imperial policy. Julia Domna watched these developments with growing horror. Her influence remained strongest in the eastern provinces, where her Syrian heritage and patronage of philosophy had built deep networks of loyalty. Yet even there, her presence could not counteract the growing discontent. Local revolts flared, and imperial representatives struggled to impose order without relying on increasingly violent suppression. The once glorious Severan experiment had become a regime of forced unity, silenced opposition, and perpetual motion. Caracalla's obsession with Alexander the Great culminated in a journey to the east, where he sought to emulate the Macedonians' conquests and spiritual path. He visited the temple of Apollo at Didyma, made offerings at the Great Pyramid in Egypt, and consulted oracles across Asia Minor. At every step, he demanded not merely reverence but worship. Statues were erected, inscriptions rewritten, coins minted with his image in heroic nudity, resembling gods rather than men. The line between propaganda and delusion blurred. The emperor no longer ruled from Rome but from the theater of his own myth. Meanwhile, back in the capital, whispers of rebellion began to circulate. Senators discussed possible successors in hushed tones. Generals eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who might be the next to rise or fall. The bureaucracy, exhausted and cynical, focused on self-preservation rather than reform. Merchants, landowners, and common citizens all adjusted their lives to the new normal, where law and justice had become tools of personal survival. Even the Praetorian Guard, once loyal to Caracalla, began to feel the strain. Their privileges remained, but their numbers had been purged, their loyalties tested too many times. Some began writing to distant commanders, others took quiet bribes from senatorial families seeking protection. The empire, though not yet collapsing, had lost its sense of direction. It was moving, always moving, but without destination. Caracalla's final years were marked by a pattern of flight, not only from Rome but from responsibility, introspection, and peace. He kept moving across the empire, inspecting troops, reviewing fortifications, declaring festivals, issuing coins, but never stopping long enough to face the truth of what he had done. Every city welcomed him with trumpets and triumphal arches, but none loved him. Every province fed his army and praised his image, but none trusted him. His paranoia deepened. He began executing governors on suspicion alone, banishing magistrates who hesitated before reading his decrees. Even his inner circle was not safe. Tribunes disappeared in the night. Secretaries were tortured for careless words. It became common for high-ranking officials to leave behind hidden wills and messages, preparing for death the moment they received an imperial summons. Caracalla believed himself surrounded by traitors, but it was his own shadow he feared most. And in this climate of fear and flight, the seeds of his downfall were sown. Not in Rome, not in open revolt, but in the quiet vengeance of one man wronged and underestimated, who, like Caracalla, understood the cost of betrayal. The emperor who had murdered his brother in a mother's arms would, in time, fall not to civil war or foreign invasion but to a blade wielded by one he thought beneath notice. And when the blood of Caracalla spilled across the sands of the east, there would be no Julia Domna left to weep for him. By the spring of 217 AD, Caracalla had reached the outer edges of the Roman world, far from the Senate, far from the city that once crowned him emperor, and far from the grave of the brother whose blood still marked his name. He was now encamped near Carrhae in Mesopotamia, preparing for yet another military campaign, this time against the Parthians. Yet in truth, the war had become secondary to the emperor's real obsession, himself. Surrounded by yes-men and flatterers, increasingly divorced from reality, Caracalla had transformed his court into a stage where he was both actor and audience, issuing proclamations soaked in grandeur and paranoia. His days were spent inspecting troops and monuments, his nights consumed by restlessness, fear, and the memory of Geta. For all his posturing as a new Alexander, he remained trapped in the past, haunted by the specter of the family he had destroyed. His mother, Julia Domna, had remained in Antioch, too sick to continue following her son across deserts and mountains, yet still too powerful to be ignored. She ruled in all but name from the eastern capital, issuing directives, managing correspondence, and maintaining fragile diplomatic ties with provincial governors and local monarchs who still held loyalty to the Severan dynasty. But even she could sense that her son's reign was nearing its conclusion. Caracalla's behavior had become erratic even by imperial standards. He punished entire cities for imagined slights, executed commanders on whispers of disloyalty, and increased the demands placed on provinces until revolt loomed at every horizon. His final journey, like many tyrants before him, would end not in glory but in betrayal. One of Caracalla's own officers, a man named Macrinus, head of the imperial secretariat and the Praetorian Guard, had spent years watching the emperor's mental decline. Though not a member of the aristocracy, Macrinus was ambitious, calculating, and above all, a survivor. He had witnessed the fate of too many competent men who dared to show independence under Caracalla's rule. And he knew his own life was now in danger. Rumors had reached him that the emperor, consulting astrologers as always, had been told that his successor was near, and that Macrinus, a man not of noble blood, would soon fall out of favor. Knowing that his execution was only a matter of time, Macrinus made a fateful decision. He conspired with a small group of loyal centurions and assassins, men chosen for their skill and silence, to eliminate Caracalla before Caracalla could eliminate him. The plan required precision and audacity. On April 8, 217 AD, as Caracalla traveled with a reduced escort to a temple near Carrhae, the assassins struck. While pausing to relieve himself by the roadside, the emperor was approached by a soldier posing as a guard. In a moment, the blade struck. Caracalla collapsed, stabbed in the back, his blood pooling in the dust of the empire he had ruled through fear. His bodyguards arrived too late, shocked and confused. There was no trial, no last speech, no imperial funeral worthy of a god-king. Just a body and silence. The emperor who had once imagined himself immortal was dead. News of his assassination spread quickly across the empire. Reactions were mixed. The legions, many of whom had grown tired of the emperor's arbitrary cruelty, accepted Macrinus as the new leader without much resistance. The Senate, stunned but cautiously hopeful, declared support for the new regime. Julia Domna, upon hearing of her son's death, refused to eat, drink, or seek treatment for her already failing health. She locked herself in her room and allowed grief to consume her. Within weeks, she too was dead, not by blade, but by sorrow. The Severan dynasty, born of ambition and cemented in blood, was over. Macrinus, the first emperor to rise from the equestrian class rather than the senatorial elite, inherited a broken throne. He lacked the charisma of Severus, the lineage of Caracalla, and the philosophical grace of Julia Domna. His claim was shaky, his allies uncertain, and his enemies already stirring. His rule would last barely a year before he was overthrown by a Severan relative, Elagabalus, a teenage priest from Syria backed by Julia Mesa, the sister of Julia Domna. Yet despite the brief interlude of Macrinus and the bizarre reigns that followed, the impact of Caracalla's actions would echo for generations. Rome had suffered civil wars before. It had seen incompetent rulers, madmen, and even fratricide. But never had the ideal of co-rule, so carefully constructed by Severus and Julia Domna, been so utterly demolished by those meant to embody it. Caracalla's reign did more than erase Geta. It obliterated the possibility of trust at the highest levels of government. After Caracalla, future emperors rarely considered joint rule. Power would now be concentrated, indivisible, and often paranoid. The idea of two rulers governing side by side had died not only in the physical act of murder but in the psychological aftermath that followed. The imperial family would never again be a source of unity. From the ashes of the Severan experiment rose a new kind of autocracy, one defined by military allegiance, ruthless ambition, and the suppression of all rivals, familial or otherwise. Caracalla's political purges created a blueprint for future tyrants. The erasure of Geta's name and image, the falsification of records, and the rewriting of history became standard practices in Roman politics. Subsequent emperors learned from his example not only how to seize power, but how to reshape memory itself. The art of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation and obliteration of a person's legacy, reached new heights in the years that followed. Temples once built for shared worship became sites of division. Statues that once stood side by side were torn down or modified. Mosaics were scrubbed clean of Geta's likeness. And in households across the empire, parents told their children carefully revised versions of events, omitting names and details, lest they speak treason in their own homes. The emotional legacy of Caracalla's fratricide reached even beyond politics. It shifted the culture of Rome. It introduced an age where fear became the primary emotion through which subjects related to their emperor. Where once admiration, respect, and even love had been part of the imperial image, now only terror remained. The emperors who followed, whether extravagant like Elagabalus or reformist like Diocletian, ruled in a world permanently altered by the Severan disaster. The collapse of brotherhood, the betrayal of maternal love, and the institutionalization of violence became markers of what Rome had become. It is easy to imagine what might have been. If Severus's dream had worked. If Caracalla and Geta had governed together in mutual respect. Perhaps the empire could have stabilized. Perhaps the slow decay of its institutions could have been delayed. But history is not made by dreams. It is made by choices. And Caracalla, offered every opportunity to build something new, chose instead to destroy what little remained of Roman virtue. Today, historians debate whether his actions accelerated the fall of Rome. Some argue the empire endured for centuries after his death, that other factors, economic pressure, foreign invasions, internal corruption, played more decisive roles. But few can deny that Caracalla's murder of Geta marked a symbolic point of no return. The moment when the dream of a united, multi-ethnic, and cooperative imperial dynasty died. The
moment when the purple robe of emperorship was no longer a symbol of shared responsibility, but a shroud for all who dared stand beside the throne. The echoes of that day in December 211 AD would ripple outward like blood seeping through silk. Not just through the empire, but through history itself. Through stories whispered by slaves and senators, through chronicles copied by monks in medieval monasteries, through marble ruins and faded inscriptions. The brother who died. The brother who killed. And the mother who watched it all fall apart.
As the Roman Empire trudged on through the 3rd century, bruised but still breathing, the shadows of Caracalla and Geta lingered not in statues or official commemorations. Those had long been defaced or erased, but in the uneasy silence that now governed the imperial household. Every new emperor, whether soldier, aristocrat, or pretender, would study the past not for inspiration, but for warning. The events of 211 AD had taught the Roman world a grim lesson. that power shared was power weakened, and that familial ties, once considered sacred, were now understood as liabilities in the ruthless contest for survival. No mother after Julia Domna would ever again be so intimately involved in the political education of her sons without recalling the cost she had paid. No brother would ever again look upon his sibling as a true partner in rule without first calculating the risks. The illusion of unity had been shattered, and in its place emerged an imperial culture defined by isolation, surveillance, and suspicion. Even the Senate, reduced to a ceremonial body of wealthy puppets, internalized the message. It offered loyalty not to ideals or institutions but to whichever man controlled the sword. The legal system, once grounded in precedent and reason, became a vehicle for vengeance, where accusations of treason served not justice but political expedience. The Praetorian Guard, whose shifting allegiances had become the fulcrum of power, learned that loyalty was not rewarded with stability, but with paranoia and sudden death. Provincial governors, wary of appearing too competent, cloaked their successes in modesty to avoid imperial jealousy. In this new Rome, caution was not merely a virtue. It was a survival strategy. And over it all loomed the ghost of fratricide, an act so deeply unnatural, so emotionally shattering, that it became the unspoken symbol of the empire's internal rot. Yet even as the political elite grew more jaded, the memory of Geta remained alive in corners untouched by official censorship. In provincial towns, among veterans who had once served under him, in private homes where family tragedy resonated deeper than imperial propaganda, stories of the gentle brother who had died in his mother's arms continued to circulate. Some whispered that Geta had been the better man, the more just ruler, the hope for a kinder empire. Others saw in his death the proof that kindness was weakness in a world governed by cruelty. These stories, fragmented and shaped by grief, became part of the collective trauma of a civilization now defined by its scars. Over time, even the name, Caracalla, came to embody more than the man himself. It became shorthand for fratricide, for betrayal, for the dangers of unchecked ambition. Later emperors would reference him not to glorify his conquests or reforms, but to remind themselves and their enemies what the pursuit of absolute power could demand. The Severan dynasty, once heralded as a new beginning for a diverse and expanding empire, came to be remembered primarily for its bloody end. Its experiment in joint rule, noble in theory, had collapsed under the weight of human emotion, jealousy, fear, pride, and an unrelenting thirst for control. And it left behind not a model to follow, but a cautionary tale to be studied, feared, and ultimately avoided. Yet even amid the darkness, the story of Julia Domna stands apart. Her presence at the heart of this imperial tragedy adds a layer of pathos that makes the tale of Caracalla and Geta resonate across the centuries. She was no mere passive figure, but an architect of empire, an empress who shaped philosophy, politics, and power through intellect and persuasion. And it was in her chambers that the empire's most intimate betrayal unfolded. She had raised her sons not to fight but to share, not to conquer one another but to govern together. She had believed in a vision larger than bloodlines or borders, a Rome where East and West, soldier and scholar, strength and wisdom, could coexist. But ideals alone were not enough to restrain the instincts of survival that power inevitably breeds. Julia Domna, broken by her failure and consumed by the very machine she helped build, became a symbol of Rome itself, glorious in aspiration, tragic in execution. As the centuries rolled on, Rome would see worse emperors than Caracalla and greater tragedies than Geta's death. The empire would split, reunify, and finally fall under the pressure of barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and institutional decay. But the emotional truth of the Severan collapse lingered as something deeper than political analysis could explain. It spoke to a universal theme: the fragility of human bonds when tested by ambition, the cost of power when measured in love lost, and the enduring pain of betrayal by those closest to us. Even the early Christian writers, though hostile to pagan Rome, would later draw upon the imagery of brother against brother, mother against son, not just as metaphor but as real historical example. And they found in the story of Caracalla and Geta a cautionary fable of pride, vengeance, and divine justice withheld. Later historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian, each with their biases and agendas, would attempt to make sense of the events. Some condemned Caracalla as a mad tyrant, others offered reluctant praise for his administrative reforms or military rigor. But none could erase the central horror, that a boy had died at his own mother's feet by order of his own brother, and that this crime had been followed not by repentance but by massacre, erasure, and self-glorification. In the end, the story outlasted the empire. When Rome finally fell in the West in 476 AD, few remembered the names of its last emperors. But the tale of Caracalla and Geta endured, in the pages of dusty scrolls, in the warnings of teachers to students, and in the quiet knowledge passed from generation to generation that even the greatest empires can be undone not by their enemies, but from within. Today, as ruins of Roman palaces stand silent beneath modern skies, and fragments of inscriptions lie weathered in museums and forgotten corners of the earth, one can still imagine that cold day in December when a mother wept and an empire broke. Not with a civil war, not with an invasion, but with a silent dagger, a calculated nod, and the fall of a single young man who had once been a child with a future. This was not merely the end of a brother. It was the death of possibility. The death of trust. The death of the dream that power could ever be peacefully shared. And so the legacy of that moment lives on. Not in marble, not in triumphs, but in memory, in caution, and in sorrow. For empires may rise with ambition, but they fall through fear. And Rome, for all its glory, was never more Roman than in the moment it destroyed itself. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.